Boy, you folks work a tough schedule, don't you? I mean, none of this business about coffee breaks or anything like that. Look, this last session before lunch, I think you ought to approach as playing with ideas and having fun with ideas. There is not going to be a set of therefores which will try to lead you at the end of the hour into saying this is what we must go out in the streets and march to do to change the world. What I want to do is to think about some kinds of questions that usually are not thought about when people talk about social policy. Usually when people talk about social policy, they are arguing about should we spend X number of dollars on a job training program or not. Should we have strong affirmative action or not? Should we, and so forth and so on. And what I want to do is pick up from the last question that was asked this morning, which is in fact the motivating question behind the book In Pursuit. The gentleman said, look, I have girls in my classroom who are pregnant, and it's not because they said, gee, I want to get a welfare check. It's because they want something to validate their lives, in effect. They want something to hold, something to love. And he said, look, suppose they can't even read or write. What are these kids going to do with their lives? What else is going to be out there? I'm sure everybody in this room has similar kinds of examples from your own experience. And so the question we are about to ask is, okay, what do we do with the young woman that the questioner was talking about? How is it that she is to go on and lead her life in a way, and here's the way I'm going to express the goal. What we want for her is that she arrives at the age of 70, let's say, being able to look back on who she has been and what she has done with justified satisfaction. In other words, we want her to live a satisfying life, a genuinely satisfying life. Okay, how's she going to do it? Well, one possibility is that this young woman has an IQ of 140, and even though she's come from a disadvantaged background and has not had many breaks in life, she just has enormous raw talent. In that case, it's real easy. And this country does a wonderful job of it. She will be picked up by the system. She will be picked up. She will find it very easy to get a full scholarship, not just to a good university. If she has enough talent, she can get a free ride to Harvard. Easy. I say that out of a lot of work that I've been doing on a book that will be appearing this fall, which I hope will also be on the table next year for you to buy, called The Bell Curve. And among the other things we've looked at, what happens to the top 10% of the ability distribution of kids in this country in terms of going to college? And the answer is, even though I'm sure each of us can think of specific people who are exceptions, the answer is this country is incredibly efficient at identifying those kids and getting them on to school, no matter how poor or disadvantaged they've been. So if she has that going for her, then no problem. Suppose she's not that talented, but she's still got a lot on the ball. There are still then an awful lot of ways in this society at this time that we can help her get ahead. We can provide her with opportunities for education, for a variety of other things, and she'll probably do real well. And when I say probably do real well, that's not wishful thinking. Again, if an analysis of what happens to everybody, let's say in the top half of the ability distribution, no matter what their socioeconomic background or their race, the answer is, in this society at this time, we've been remarkably successful in providing routes for her to go out and live her life and so forth. Now, suppose she's in the bottom half of ability. And let's not just think about IQ, let's think about charm, personality, industriousness. As teachers in classrooms, you are aware of something which has been almost a taboo to talk about in the last 20 years, which is that 50% of the population is below average. I have gotten booed on college campuses for making that statement. I suppose 50% are below the median. Okay, if the math teacher's out there, all right, I'll correct it. There are a large portion of the American population is never going to be a nuclear physicist no matter how many opportunities they get. They aren't even going to be the best used car salesman in California no matter how many opportunities they get. They aren't bad people. They aren't exceptionally unable. They're just sort of below average in looks, and industriousness, and intelligence, and what else. A properly run society should be one in which these people, too, can reach the age of 70 and be justifiably proud of who they have been and what they have done. Because if you define society in any other way, where you say, look, if the luck of the draw doesn't give you some kind of exceptional ability, too bad for you, then I think we're in big trouble. Because I agree with those who say there is no such thing as merit in having an IQ of 140. That's just plain dumb luck. You ought to be extremely grateful for it. You ought to thank God every day that you've had it, but it's not your doing. And similarly, if you get the short end of the stick, it's not your fault. And it's society's obligation to figure out a way for all of us. Now, so far there is nothing that separates me from just about any political stripe. On the contrary, a great deal of the left and egalitarianism has been based on precisely the same observation that what you get in terms of your natural abilities is the luck of the draw, and the conclusion that they have drawn from that is that what you want above all is to equalize outcomes. Particularly in the area of money, what you do is redistribute income so that everybody has as close to the same as you can, and you try to minimize the effects of these artificial advantages that some people have and some people don't. Here is where I part company, and perhaps it's appropriate to mention a word about why I part company from a kind of personal perspective. It may surprise some of you to know that I started out life after I left college in the Peace Corps. This was back in 1965, and I went over to Thailand and was working in villages. My job actually was building privies. It was selling privies. And I can tell you more about the merits of the water seal privy than anyone you've ever met. It really is a terrific invention, but never mind. I won't go into it right now. But I was selling privies and working in Thai villages. If you want to see poverty, go with me to a Thai village. Because poverty, as measured by any kind of material standard of living in a Thai village, is far worse than it is in the poorest communities in the United States. And any of those of you who have worked in third world countries know that to be true. No electricity, no running water, you know, go on and on and on. There's just no comparison in terms of very specifically material resources. As I was riding around in jeeps between Thai villages, though, and I was passing the time daydreaming, I would occasionally say, gee, what would happen if for some reason there were nuclear war or something and I found myself stuck up in rural Thailand for the rest of my life? What would I do if I were suddenly completely divorced from my life as a Westerner? And the answer was I could make a quite decent life for myself. Thais are wonderful people, just wonderful people to be around. And the women are beautiful. That wouldn't have been a problem in terms of getting married and having a family. But also the life of a Thai village, even though it's very poor, is in many ways extremely attractive. It's a very open and free and easy life, and there's a lot of sharing that goes on, and there's lots of fun, and there's lots of laughter. And I realize it isn't the life I would choose to be a subsistence rice farmer in a Thai village, but I could live that. Now, you ask me, could I make a life for myself in the South Bronx? Now, forget about color and race and so forth. Assume that that's not an issue in terms of getting along in the neighborhood. And the answer is, I would have a real tough time making a life for myself and a family in the South Bronx, even though I would have lots more money. I could try within the confines of my own apartment to sort of have a little world of my own with the books I wanted and so forth. But as soon as I stepped outside that front door, I would be assaulted by a world in which my children would be in danger, in which civility has become very scarce. There are all sorts of ways that I could not have made a satisfying life for myself in the South Bronx, whereas I could in a Thai village. This is all by way of explaining to you why it is that I have become absorbed with what is it that goes into the constituent elements of living a satisfying life. And that brings us back again to the young woman that we were talking about, who we decided needs to live a satisfying life, but without any access to the glamorous stuff. Okay? Now, how is it that she too can work out okay the same as I could have in a Thai village? Well, there are answers. And there are answers whether she is a male or a female. She can become a good parent. Or if we were talking about a young man, he could become a good parent. He can become a good neighbor. He can be the kind of person who people around him say, boy, Joe's really a terrific guy to call on. And you can always call on Joe to help. The woman can be the kind of person who everybody thinks of as being a valued part of their neighborhood and their world. Now, in saying that these are roles that they can take up that will give them legitimate satisfaction, let me be quite clear about one thing. I am not saying for the talented folks who are lucky, they have all of these much more desirable ways to live a satisfying life, and our young woman here is stuck with these. I think that I know as I have gotten older, yes, I get satisfactions out of having written books and out of coming to places like this and giving speeches. My professional life gives me a lot of satisfaction. But the satisfactions I get from being a good parent and a good neighbor are getting more and more important in the scheme of things. And I suspect there are a lot of people in this room who have gone through the same kind of experience. That the roles I have given these people are among the most satisfying roles there are. So that the difference is this: the more talent you have, the more options there are for all the ways in which your professional life can be satisfying. The less talent you have, the more the options for a satisfying life focus in on a very few, the ones I've just described. So now the question is, okay, we've decided this young woman has before her the possibility of becoming a good parent and a good neighbor, and this is one of her chief ways in which she's going to live a satisfying life. How precisely is she going to reach that state of affairs? Well, first we've got to shepherd her through adolescence. It was said in the question that she's had a baby and that she's already reached that age and she's made a mistake. How is it that she wouldn't have made that mistake? Because a lot of girls did not, in past decades, make that mistake of getting pregnant and having the baby at that age. Well, it goes back to some things I was saying earlier this morning. She didn't get pregnant in earlier decades because she was scared stiff about getting pregnant and because the entire society said to her, don't do this thing. I'm now asking you to look at that state of affairs no longer just in terms of how is it that we can keep the number of illegitimate babies low. I'm asking you to think of it in terms of what that young woman desperately needs in order to keep a route open to a satisfying life. She desperately needs to grow up in a world in which those signals are given to her so strongly that she doesn't make this mistake, even though she wants something to love even at that age. She still wants to, but she can't do it. And why can't she do it? Well, this goes to the other point that was raised by the last question. He was talking about self-esteem. Let's think about self-esteem for a minute. Remember I said at the beginning of the session that we were going to play with ideas, okay? It's not a linear thing. I'm now going to stop and talk a little bit about self-esteem and self-respect. And the reason I say self-esteem and self-respect is because they are two different things. Self-esteem is the phrase that is out there these days. That's what everybody talks about. But the distinction between self-esteem and self-respect is crucial. Michael Walzer, who is a social philosopher of the left, actually, but who is a very smart man and has written some brilliant work, has a lovely passage in one of his books where he talks about the distinction between self-esteem and self-respect. He says, self-esteem is that thing which we can acquire if enough people tell us that we deserve it. So that if enough people say to me that they love my books, no matter what I think of the books, I will feel pretty good about that after a period of time. People can sort of shower that kind of thing on me and create a sense of self-esteem. Self-respect, Walzer says, though, is a different thing, because with self-respect, there is an internal judge, and you can't fudge it with that internal judge. Self-respect comes from your own judgment of your own behavior and saying that, yes, what I have done is worthwhile or not, and it doesn't really make any difference if anybody pats me on the back if the internal judge says that I've screwed up. Okay. Here's another way to think about the distinction between self-esteem and self-respect. Think of the two. This is courtesy of another thinker. This is not again, this is not original with me, but another philosopher says, suppose that you have a sentence in which you speak of a person having too much self-esteem. Everybody in this room knows what that sentence means. Suppose we say he has too much, he respects himself too much. That sentence doesn't parse. That sentence doesn't quite make sense. He respects himself too much. It's kind of a logical impossibility. That's the distinction. So what I'm suggesting with regard to the issue of the young woman is it's utterly essential that she feel self-respect. And the only way you can feel self-respect is if you have something authentically to be pleased with yourself. Now, in terms of as an adolescent, how is that going to come about? Well, how is it she's going to resist this natural impulse to have something she wants to hold and to love? It is if she acquires self-respect by restraining herself. She's not going to do it well, she may do it just out of fear. But it is absolutely essential, again, that what she is doing and the way she is behaving is valued by the society in a way that she can say to herself, I'm a good girl, in an important way. Problem. In order to achieve that state of affairs, you have to be willing to condemn people who don't behave that way. And here is where, in the contemporary era, we have a big problem because nobody wants to say anything bad about anybody. But if you are going to acquire self-respect for sexual restraint as an adolescent, then the people who don't exhibit sexual restraint as adolescents have to be condemned. By that I don't mean condemned to hard labor or anything. So you have to issue, God help us, a value judgment about their behavior. Okay? And I'm trying to come at this from another angle from the way we usually come at it. I'm trying to say, we aren't reading off the tablets from the mountain saying you are good and you are bad. We are talking about the way in which this young woman can get through adolescence to live a satisfying life. And I'm saying to you that the things that we usually talk about as value judgments and ethics and value, all that stuff is absolutely essential to her in order to get from here to there. Now, let's pursue it some more. Good neighbor, good parent. That's what we want to have as satisfying roles. Another problem. It's hard to be a good neighbor if the only things that the neighborhood does are to get together for backyard barbecues. Being a good neighbor in the sense of it providing a rich source of satisfaction to you demands that the neighborhood be doing a lot more important things than just existing side by side. Again, among the affluents and those who have lots of opportunities, their neighborhood is probably not their geographic neighborhood. Lots of people in this room have professional friends scattered out all over town. You have clubs and associations and hobbies and activities and a whole bunch of things which geographically may have no relationship to your house, but they constitute a community in which you are a good neighbor. All right? The poorer you are, the less you have in the way of these other kinds of intellectual or other kinds of activities, the more important that geographic neighborhood becomes. Now, with this in mind, think of social policy over the last 30 years in a completely new light. We are no longer talking about whether the government has spent too much money or too little. We're no longer talking about whether we've coddled criminals or the rest of it. Here is the way I would frame what's really happened to social policy in the last 30 years, and to more, in another sense, the last 50 or 60 years. We have systematically taken functions away from the neighborhood to be filled by other institutions. Now, is that good or is that bad? Is it more efficient to say, we are no longer going to rely on the church to feed the poor, we are going to use the instruments of government for this? Well, I'm going to kind of put this aside. Put that aside and don't even worry about it for the moment. I'm making a much more limited comment. Suppose you are told, somebody comes knocking at the door and says to you, do you want to go out and feed the hungry? And you're sitting there watching TV. And your response is quite naturally, well, if I don't go out and feed the hungry, what's going to happen? If the answer is, well, if you don't go out and feed the hungry, there's a bureaucracy of about 600 people with a budget of $25 million that's supposed to feed the hungry, then it's a very natural thing for you to say, thanks, I'll watch TV and let them feed the hungry. If they say to you, if you don't feed the hungry, nobody will. That puts a completely different light on your obligation, your felt obligation to do something. I have an illustration of this that probably says more about my own lack of character than anything else, but in the Murray household, my wife always turns down the thermostat at night before we go to bed. I don't refuse to turn down the thermostat. It's not as if I'm too lazy to turn down the thermostat, but she does it. Miraculously, every time that she happens to be visiting somewhere and is away for the night and is not there, miraculously, I somehow remember to turn down the thermostat, even though I never remember to turn it down when she's around. In that very homely way, an awful lot of the stuff of life that happens or doesn't happen happens because either we have the action or we don't. Either we have the responsibility or we don't. It involves a whole set of things that are things that you do not choose to do if you're given the option, but you're glad you did if you end up doing them. You all know what I mean. You all know about times in which you really didn't want to do something, and you also understand that it's only because you did that you gain satisfaction. Kids? Those of you who have kids, and how many of you have yearned for a full-time nanny to take care of those kids? All right? And how many of you also understand that if you had a full-time nanny to take care of those kids, it is not true that you would then spend exactly the appropriate amount of time, quality time, as the phrase goes, with those children, which would let you have the relationships with them that would be rich and rewarding. You know very well that the rich and rewarding relationship comes out of everything from changing diapers at the very beginning to putting up with all sorts of stuff through childhood and into adolescence, a lot of which is no damn fun. And at any one time, if you had the option of not doing it, you wouldn't do it. But in fact, you have to do it in order to get the stuff out. That's what I'm saying about neighborhoods and social policy. That if you are going to have vital neighborhoods, Edmund Burke's little platoons is the image I have in mind. If you're going to have those, there is only one way to get them, and that is to have the neighborhood and the community have the action for very important social functions of life. And that's how I get from a consideration of the young woman that we were talking about to conclusions which say, you know what I really want to do with social policy in this country is decentralize like crazy. Take the resources we're currently spending, fine. Find some way to get those resources back down to the lowest possible level, and not with the government as a partner, but with total responsibility for the allocation of those resources left within the local community. And the reason you're doing this is not because you think it's more efficient, although I think it would be, but for the same reason that Henry Stimson, the former Secretary of State, once said, the only way to make a man trustworthy is to trust him. Well, the only way to make communities function and be vital is to give communities something to do. So that's one conclusion of social policy I would draw from that. There is another broad set of things that I would draw from conclusions I would draw from social policy from this kind of analysis. And they have to do with the ways in which human beings live morally autonomous lives. See, in some sense, I suppose it could be said that I am trying to maneuver the young woman that is our continuing example. I ought to give her a name. Phyllis. We're trying to maneuver Phyllis through adolescence. As those of you who've read Losing Ground know, I have a couple in there called Harold and Phyllis, and so we will use Harold and Phyllis. We're trying to get Phyllis through adolescence, and in some ways, yes, I'm manipulating her in this sense. I want to have society give her such strong messages in adolescence that she will get across that tightrope into her 20s and 30s when she'll begin to appreciate the value of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Similarly, I want to take a young man whose dearest desires at the age of 17 are not to go to work at a low-paying, menial job for 40 hours a week. He has lots of things he'd rather do than that, but he really does need to do that if he's going to get his foot in the door in the workforce and eventually be able to be a father and neighbor. So I'm trying to maneuver them through that. But that's a side issue really to the larger objective of letting people be masters of their own lives. Let's start from the assumption that anybody who is not clinically retarded has it in them to live a morally autonomous life. And without condescension, we can say they make choices. These choices have consequences. And it's not just the rich folks or the well-educated folks who are able to make those choices, it's just about everybody. You start from that statement, but I think there's another statement you can add to that. Everyone has a moral compass, but some moral compasses are more susceptible to magnetic storms than others. Some of you, I bet, when you have studied various courses in ethics and so forth, have run across Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Very popular for a long time. And if you remember the examples, is it Kohlberg or Kohler? I might have the name wrong. Anyway, he starts out with the most simplistic kinds of moral judgments, and then he gets up to the most highest sophisticated level, which involves the example of a man who has a wife who is dying of a disease, and he goes and he steals the medicine. Is this a moral act? Yes, it is a moral act because you have competing values here, and the overarching value should be the life of his wife, and so it is moral to steal under these circumstances. All very interesting. It is also exactly the kind of a moral hierarchy that would be developed by a professor at Harvard. Which is to say that, yeah, I mean, it's bright and it's smart and it's sophisticated, and there's some truth to it too, but the fact is, in 99.9% of the cases, it's wrong to steal. Fine, people who go to Harvard can try to live their lives by the moral hierarchy. It's a whole lot easier if society is organized around the principle, thou shalt not steal, than around the principle, thou shalt not steal unless there's a really good reason to. And what we have done, again, trying to take a new slant on social policy, what we've done for the last 30 years is install a criminal justice code which makes it as hard as possible for people to understand what is the right and wrong thing to do. So that if you come before, if you do something wrong and you get caught, A, you probably aren't going to get caught. B, if you get caught, probably nothing's going to happen at all. C, if something happens at all and you're charged with anything, it's probably not going to be what you actually did. It's going to be some plea bargain thing. D, once you're convicted of it, who knows what's going to happen to you, whether you're going to get thrown in jail for 10 years for 1/8 of an ounce of marijuana or whether you're going to be let go free for an aggravated assault. Very hard to tell there. So we have systematically made it real tough, particularly for people who don't have a lot going for them in terms of intellectual sophistication, to have their moral compass point in the directions of right and wrong. We have, if you want to think of social policy in this light, made it just about as difficult as we can for a certain kind of person to get ahead in this world. There's a wonderful phrase in the United States, sweat equity. It's a new phrase, but it's straight in line with the American ideal. Sweat equity just means if you work hard enough, you can get something going. And historically in this country, what it's meant is if you wanted to open a shop or you wanted to run a little business, you could try to scrape together a little money here and a lot of work there, and you could try to get that thing going. And you didn't have to be a genius. What you really had to do was have a lot of determination and energy and so forth. Here's another way of looking at what we've done with social policy. We have made it very, very tough for those people to do that anymore. Any of you who has tried to open a small business recently knows exactly what I mean. You had better be prepared to have a certain kind of skill, cognitive skill, or else you better be prepared to have a lot of money so you can hire accountants or whatever and lawyers in order to get something going. A new way of looking at social policy, what we have done is, in effect, we've had affirmative action for lawyers, whereby we have created systematically a whole bunch of ways in which you can make a whole lot of money being a lawyer, not because being a lawyer has any natural virtue to it, but because we have created rules which are congenial to lawyers and which mean that lawyers are worth money because of the regulations. Cut it out is my social policy recommendation. And in all sorts of ways, go back to first principles and say, look, it's real nice to save money on our tax bills, and that's one reason for making government smaller and so forth. But the bigger reason for doing this is because what we are doing is impeding the ability of people to pursue happiness. And that's why I have the subtitle phrase that I have in the book. And the reason why you go back to a Jeffersonian conception of how government and society ought to be organized is because those guys were right. When they formed the Constitution, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they had very deep insight into the way it is that human beings go about living satisfying lives. And what we have done systematically in the last 50 years is forget those lessons. So that's the direction at which I want to move back. Now, how is it that I think that in the late 20th century, at a time when people move around constantly, that they can form these nice, cohesive little neighborhoods? Why is it that I think that in an age of MTV that you can have, you'd be raising children to be these young Jeffersonian citizens that I'm describing? Well, these are questions we can talk about in the question and answer period and so forth. They are ones that in many ways I don't have answers I can prove, but I guess I would ask you all to look to your own experience and look to the ways in which in your lives the things that do give you satisfaction and the ways that you do get along bear a strong resemblance to the kind of dynamics I've just described. I've moved out of the center of Washington to a small town of 200 people about 5 years ago with my wife and family. And I am constantly struck by the extent to which what we are doing in that small town, which, by the way, is not a Norman Rockwell small town. It bears more relationship to Peyton Place than it does to Norman Rockwell, but it's still a small town. And we still function. A lot of ways in which the kind of Jeffersonian republic I'm talking about exists on the sly. We sort of do it. We have all sorts of things that we can't do because the county government, the state government, the federal government won't let us. But in lots of ways, we go about doing things exactly the way I've described, and it still happens all over America. We have a kid in town who has cancer. We have a spaghetti supper. This is a town of 200 people surrounded by farms, and we raise $5,000 for the kid. Somebody's barn burned down. We have a barn raising, for heaven's sakes. I mean, barn raisings still occur. Read any small town newspaper and you will see these kinds of things going on. I am saying that if you look at the American people, we have a long history of that, and not just in small towns. We have a history of that in big towns and cities. Go look at Harlem in the 1940s, 1930s, at a time when blacks in this country were systematically oppressed in ways which are almost unimaginable today. and look at the vitality of life in Harlem at that time, and the ways in which, in all sorts of ways, the stuff of life was taken care of by the people who lived there. I'm saying that historically, there's no reason to think that you can't have that again if we will only have the kind of faith in people that led to the founding of the country. I guess that in the shorter term, what I would ask people to do when they are considering social policy and what they're for and what they're against is to make sure that they are not guilty of a double standard. If you say to yourself that the kinds of things that you value, the things that give meaning and satisfaction in your life, bear a strong resemblance to what I've said, be careful that you don't turn around and say, oh, but for poor people, or for disadvantaged people, of course, it's not the same for them. What we must do, first of all, for them is equalize money, or we must do this, that, and the other thing. Wait a minute. If you're saying that what's good for them is different than what's good for you, think again. Make sure that you're willing to live with the consequences of your own ideas if you should happen to be poor tomorrow as well. Well, at the beginning I said that we were not going to reach the end with a clear-cut agenda, policy agenda, but what I have implied it obviously points to a much simpler, smaller, decentralized America. What I have also advocated points to an America which is much more like, I'm not doing this to try to curry favor, it bears a lot more resemblance to Texas than it does to New York City. Texas being one of the places I like to come to because I detect a lot of these attitudes more openly here than I do elsewhere. One way or another, I'm afraid that we are headed toward a Latin American kind of conservatism and democracy, in which you have people who are the haves, who live in the big houses on the hill, and who are worried about keeping the folks down in the valley from coming up and trashing their houses for the ways I talked about earlier this morning. This last 45 minutes has been a way to give you a vision of a way not only that things once were in this country, but the way things might be again. Thank you.
We have time for questions now. Let me, we talked about discrimination earlier in the week. Let me discriminate against those people that have asked questions before and encourage people, at least to the start, who have been free writing during the question and answer session. So anybody who hasn't asked a question before that has a question for Dr. Murray?
They're also welcome to argue with me. There's,
yes, okay. This is the, yes, and please stand up. And others that haven't asked a question before can be preparing, if you would, to ask a question.
Dr. Murray, in November I had the pleasure of reading your article about the underprivileged, the white class, in the journal.
Yeah.
And I did something I'd never done before. I sat down and decided that I would write a letter to the editor concerning your article. I was extremely impressed with it. Statistically, it sounded as though it was very sound, that you'd done incredible research. I've always enjoyed your writing. But I wondered, my question is, why did you not include the Hispanics or the Mexican Americans? And after you answer that, do you not think they should be
included in the general argument?
In the statistical study.
Yeah. She's referring to an article that was in the Wall Street Journal last fall about the emerging white underclass. The simple answer to your question is, in a piece that length, you can't do everything. And in fact, that 22% figure for out-of-wedlock births for whites refers to all whites, including Hispanics, Latinos, and so forth. So, point number one is, Hispanics should be included in that they were not reflected the difficulties of working that in. But now that you've raised the question, let me just say briefly what the situation is. With Hispanics, they're sort of halfway in between in terms of the numbers between blacks and whites and Anglo-white. I'm going to continue to use white, but now I'm referring to Anglo-whites. So that if you think in terms of those groups, it's Anglo-whites, you've got about 18% of births out of wedlock. Blacks, you've got 68. And Latinos is in the neighborhood of 39%. So they're halfway in between. They obviously also are undergoing a very rapid transition because Hispanics have, most of those communities have very strong family traditions. And in many ways, if you plotted the rate at which things have been changing in that community, my suspicion is that the rate of change is faster there than it is in the white community. So there is nothing to be sanguine about in terms of the Hispanic experience in this regard. Yeah.
Question back here?
There's one back here.
If you have another question, you might raise your hand now. We've got another mic that can get its way to you.
I don't think you should discriminate too much against people who've already asked questions. I mean, maybe.
I wanted to ask a question dealing with your self-esteem and self-respect type differences. In the public schools, at least in my experience, we have a big push on the self-esteem element in the children. And so much of it appears to me to be more like teach them self-deception. Show them an idea of themselves that is pleasing.
Make them feel good about themselves.
Right. May not be truthful, and it seems to be so prevalent in our special education program and mainstreaming the kids and giving them certain grades. It's just been a real problem with me to the extent where I feel dishonest with the grades that I am forced, in quotes,
And it
to
doesn't
give.
fool the kids for very long.
No, you don't.
I mean,
so their self-respect does not go up, and yours doesn't either.
No, it's
Goes down. So I'd like for you to comment on that.
yeah. This is another bit of this double standard that I was talking about. Now, all of us as parents, I'm sure, have somewhat different parenting styles, and we all do different things with our kids. But it's useful to talk about the way we deal with our own kids because they are so close to our hearts. Well, now, do we go out of our way to make our children feel bad? No, we don't. And if we can sugarcoat a sad experience for them, you know, they lose in the final seconds of the game, you really emphasize how hard they tried as opposed to the fact they lost. And all of us do that as parents, but also I think all of us as parents have a strong sense that it does the child no good whatsoever to lie to the child about the ultimate reality of things. And so when the child does something for which the appropriate response is a reprimand, the appropriate response is to say you can't do that, the appropriate response is to say that's wrong, that you've got to do it. And the fact that that makes the child feel bad is part and parcel of something very valuable you're trying to do for the child. And why we take that understanding, which is so obvious to any parent, and say, oh, by the way, though, that doesn't apply to the way that school teachers should deal with children they care for, is crazy. And it doesn't work. I mean, no child, children are pretty smart about this stuff, and I don't need to tell you these things. You know more about it than I do, but they are not deluded by this making them feel good about themselves stuff. All it does is undermine what should be the kinds of things they can have confidence really mean something. It gives them very little they can grasp onto and say, boy, I can truly be proud of myself because this thing I've just done is validated by the school, by my teachers, by my parents, by my community. Toward the back there.
Yes, I wanted to return to the comment you just made about the Hispanic community because I've worked in a low-income Hispanic area for about 8 years, and I've always had a problem with the idea that you just expressed, that people inherently think that there's something inherent about Hispanics, and largely it's the idea, well, they're Catholic. and they have strong families and all this type of thing. But my theory about that has always been that the Hispanics have begun to suffer from the same problems, being what I call victimized by the welfare system that has happened in other communities. And it doesn't take very long for the maybe first or second generation, after maybe they've come to this country, to suffer the same things that are suffered in other communities.
Yeah, and for the matter, it's happening with the Vietnamese. It's happening with a lot of East Asian communities, which have incredibly strong families. Nobody is immune to this. And for that matter, what I'm always asked when I'm with less sympathetic audiences is, well, what about Sweden? You know, where Sweden has half the kids born out of wedlock, and doesn't this prove you can do it? Sweden, on the contrary, is exactly, just sort of shows that you can even take Swedes, and over a period of time, the deterioration starts to set in terms of the way the society functions and the rest of it. Nobody's immune to this stuff. What we're talking about is very basic ways in which human beings function with each other. You know? And the Hispanic community, I'm not plugged into that community. Living as I do in Washington, it's not near the Washington area, it's not nearly as prevalent a group as it is in the Southwest. But the signs are very scary. Go ahead, go right ahead.
I have to confess, I have a tendency to be one of those bleeding hearts. And I find your ideas extremely intriguing. And as I sit here and listen, and they make so much sense to somebody like me who is your typical bleeding heart, I'm wondering, since you don't advocate forced sterilization, and you don't and you allow the 9 months and 2 weeks or whatever,
Yeah.
which seems terribly reasonable to me, that's kind of fair warning. What objections are you running up against, especially among conservatives? I mean, like the Republicans with Reagan.
Yeah.
What is it? Is it just political to them? Is that why they're afraid of your ideas?
That's very interesting. This Wall Street Journal piece that was mentioned a few minutes ago came out, I wrote it not expecting anything in particular to happen, because I advocate all of this in that piece. And it just caused an extraordinary reaction. And for the first time in my life, I had people saying, damn right. Before, the typical ways in which people describe my ideas are interesting and provocative, or as you just said, intriguing. And it's very seldom people say, yeah, that's what we ought to do. And particularly when I'm saying get rid of the welfare system. And this time there was a very broad spectrum of people who were saying, yes, the problem we're talking about is so severe that we've got to start thinking in these terms of these solutions. The Republicans, fascinating case. You have a few like Bill Bennett, William Kristol, and others who agree with me and are openly advocating getting rid of the welfare system. And what you do, by the way, in addition to having the 9 months and 2 weeks warning, you would also make sure that, for example, adoption services are very readily available. You do a lot of things in which the woman has a set of decisions before she ends up walking home with a baby by herself without a husband. But so they're on board with that. But an awful lot of Republicans in the House and Senate are very nervous about that. They're concerned that they will not be seen as compassionate. Republicans are real worried about not being compassionate. They really want people to think well of them in this regard, and they're worried about it politically. You know, the GFL, and I say to them, you know, I think you got hold of the wrong end of the stick. My sense is that that's simply not what the voters are worried about right now. But that has been a strong reaction on their part, and there is this other part of the. An awful lot of Republicans are quite comfortable with big government. They're comfortable with big government if it involves a subsidy that they like, as opposed to a subsidy they don't like. They are in favor of big government if it serves their interests, or what they think are the interests of their constituents. And they, as well as the Democrats, are inclined to say, oh, if you do that, you will have women starving in the streets, and children. And when I say to them, you know, this country does not have a history of letting women and children starve in the streets. And that just because the government doesn't do something to help doesn't mean that nobody's going to do anything to help. The only thing is that the help that will be given is going to be much more effective, because help that's coming from neighbors and friends and communities and so forth is going to come along. It's, you know, if you want to put it roughly, what you're going to say is, Marge, we aren't going to let you starve in the streets, but you've got to stop doing this stuff. I mean, there's just going to be a, you know, a much closer relationship in the way the help is given. And a lot of Republicans have bought into the notion that you got to have the government do it because you can't rely on people to do it. And I think that I see as one of my missions in life, because I'm not a political activist at all, but when I see somebody like Bill Bennett and William Kristol who are getting on board this way, I'd like to redefine the politics in this country where you actually have a large political force which is authentically in favor of the kinds of things that Thomas Jefferson was in favor of. That's a long way off. By the way, my wife was also a bleeding heart, and she's now a libertarian. She sort of passed me, but you know, I will be quite candid with you. An awful lot of the reason for the influence of Losing Ground, and the reason that it got the reaction it did, was that it came across in the book that I also care about poor people, and I also care about this, and this was such a novel experience for someone who was writing from an apparently conservative perspective to give that indication that it really irritated the left enormously. How can he claim that he cares about poor people when he's a conservative? Because we all know conservatives don't care about poor people. Some of my best friends are liberals.
Another question, and microphones are, I see a question here. Mike. If I could ask you to stand too.
I know what you say about the growing problem in the Hispanic community is true, because I've worked there the last 3 years. But would you please explain where you get your statistics on the Asian community and how quickly that problem's increasing?
Don't have real good numbers. You have things from specific cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, where they have very large Asian communities. So that the welfare, you know, we know that the welfare recipiency for certain Asian groups in San Francisco and California has really skyrocketed. We may have national numbers for illegitimacy for Asians as a whole. I think we do, as a matter of fact, and they are still low. They're still down around 10%, if memory serves me correctly, but they've been going up fast. And you also have very different susceptibility to different groups, so that the Chinese remain pretty solid. But certain of the hill tribe groups from Vietnam and Laos have become almost massively welfare dependent, and there's a lot of variation there.
We have time for one more question. Is the mic?
I would like to see you do something with gangs, because that's something that we are seeing more and more of and dealing with more and more in the public school. Asian gangs as well, and I think that's telling us a lot of things. As a teacher, one of the things that I think most of our teachers keep talking about is the fact that the children have no responsibility. And I perceive in what you're saying is that we need to give responsibility back, and that the government has taken a great deal of the responsibility, and teachers are being asked to take responsibility for any failure.
Yeah, and you are being asked to take the responsibility, and you also are not being given the freedom to try to construct an environment in which that's reasonable.
Because we can't teach them responsibility.
Yeah. No, one of the things I didn't do today, and I wish I had done more of, is talk about your situation as teachers, and all the ways in which what has happened to you, seems to me, is that social policy has taken all the reasons why many of you, I assume, went into teaching, which I presume is because most of you love to teach, and has made it as hard as possible for you to do that thing which got you into the teaching profession in the first place. Because it's a classic example of it should be real easy to get first-rate people to want to become teachers. And the reason it should be easy is because teaching is one of the most satisfying jobs that society has in its gift. And what we've done is take all the ways in which you should be able to attract first-rate people to teaching, and we've said, oh, we're going to strip the job of all these things that make it fun and make it rewarding, and then we'll worry about teachers' salaries as a way of getting good people into the profession. And I'm not arguing against high salaries for teachers, don't worry, but I am saying, come on, high salaries. We aren't trying to bribe people to be teachers. What we want to do is let people be teachers. And it's another example of how we stumble over our own foot, or shoot ourselves in the foot. I think we have one more? One more.
Okay. I grew up during the era when Hispanics and Spanish were considered as white when I was real young, and as the years went by, we learned that they wanted to be a separate race, which they are, and they're entitled to be a separate race. And my understanding is your book is recent, and how is it that they were lumped with as in the white race and not being a race of their own?
That's in Losing Ground, you mean, in the book? That's real simple, because there simply was not a breakout of numbers. If you've looked at Losing Ground, you'll see that each chapter goes to the government numbers and tries to trace them back from 1950 to 1980. And you simply could not do it. The government did not start to collect Hispanic identification until, I think, the 1980s for an awful lot of the indicators, and for a few of them, I guess, the 1970s. So you just couldn't do it. And fortunately now and in the future, you will be able to do this kind of thing, and I fully expect that people will be. It's too bad we couldn't do it before. This has been lots of fun. Thanks very much.